application within the city, first line of defense, Kevin will review that, and he'll evaluate, is there some aspect of the water rules in this state that are affected by this project? Do we have to review it for that? And there are standards for him to evaluate that. And he'll review that and advise the applicant. This has to go for watershed review, so they're gonna require this packet of information from you. You're gonna have to submit a proposal to demonstrate that you comply with their rules. And then actually that gets shipped to the commission, and the commission reviews it.
So with the amount of wetlands we have, does pretty much anything go to you? I mean, isn't that pretty much everywhere? Or is
Yeah,
it-
and the wetlands is there's a wetland review that's separate from the watershed. The watershed will ask for the wetland information as part of the review, but that's almost a subset
Okay.
review that falls under the WAC, the Wetland Conservation Act, so.
And we're actually gonna look at a couple samples of those reviews, a little bit later, so you'll see
And they're,
exactly what we're
just to
talking
maybe answer, they're based on like land disturbance or on amount of impervious. So most of the standards and thresholds are based on those two criteria, either land disturbance or
Yeah.
impervious.
And I brought in the Napa project for the new Napa building here, because it's a good example, and you'll see, we'll go through it fairly quickly, but you'll see what triggers a review and why. Kevin can comment on that.
And Corcoran is also subject to this same standard.
Yes, and the cities themselves. So what, for example, if the city is putting a new road in, the city has to submit its own database of information and its own application to the watershed. The watershed will come back to the city and say, yeah, you meet the standard here, but you're not meeting the standard here, you have to go back and redesign this. So for example, the Hackamore Road project, if you're familiar with that at all, that went through review with the watershed, and we said, okay, you're affecting drainage here, do you meet our standards or not in terms of how much water's going where, and how can you protect the water that's going there, and all that kind of stuff. So the city had, as an applicant.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So there's a new development here going in across the street, kind of from where I live.
Yes,
And we've had a lot of rain,
Yes.
water this year. That pond that used to be over there is almost empty. So I'm just wondering where all the water's going.
yeah, that's a really good point, because and I will tell you again, from personal experience, back when we got the early phases of Ravinia, same issue, where we had a community member who lived on Hackamore, and every spring would get runoff from a farm field that ran across his property, and the swale where it ran across was right where his pond was, or his swimming pool, or his pool. So he's getting field runoff in his swimming pool. And the first time it was while I was mayor, I got a call from him, I got this issue. I said, let's go up, let's meet for a cup of coffee. We had a cup of coffee. And I tried to convey to him the message, and it's odd that a lot of the existing conditions actually are improved by going through the development process, because I don't want to get too far afield here, but if there's a farm field or just a natural area and there's natural drainage there, there's maybe a swale, a long waterway where when it rains, the water's just making its way down that depression into a wetland. That's been like that for as long as 150 years or whatever. And there's not much that, the city really doesn't have much authority over that situation. So in this case, for example, where we had a tilled field that was creating runoff every spring, going across the neighbor's yard and polluting his pond and his swimming pool, the city really had no authority over that situation. And I remember telling him it's really a private landowner dispute. He didn't want to hear that. He was really not happy with that response. Why can't the city fix this for me? What I told him was, when this property develops, then we can fix it, because we can impose requirements on the developer that he fixes that drainage so it's not washing across your property like that. Generally, I mean, little exceptions there. So the point there is that what happened, no doubt, is that the engineering involved in that development affected the condition that existed beforehand. And we'll see it when we get to the example project. I would submit, without being familiar with it, that it's actually improved the overall drainage and the retention and the quality of water that's leaving the properties. So that's part of what the watershed does, and we'll see it when we get the example.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that what was established is what is true and correct. I mean, like, it could have been that that was not an ideal situation for a watershed
Exactly,
to
so,
exist.
so again, and we'll get, and we'll run out of time here, but it doesn't matter, I'll come back another day for what we don't get to. But, what we tend to forget is that if you did the, drone eye view of the city of Corcoran, you see, we can all picture, the farm fields and the treed areas and the creeks and the wetlands and all of that. What we tend not to see, and I mean, Tom and I have talked about this before, what we tend not to, what we don't think about was what was the picture of, what was the drone picture in, say, let's pick a year, 1850. Okay, go way back. In 1850, this was the big woods with sloughs and ponds and a little bit of oak savanna and not much open space, not much grassland. Okay, there was probably some in the oak savanna areas or whatever, but a lot of big woods. And then in 1852, something happened, and for the next 50 years, it changed that drone's eye view. And what happened was, we arrived and started cutting all the trees down so we could create big fields to farm on.
And we started putting drain tile in.
And we started tiling all of those fields. Not only did we put drain tile in to dry up the wetlands, but we also started tilling through the swales. So when the water had been falling on the hilltops, and a lot of it, because of the cover vegetation, had stayed there, but the stuff that ran off was running through vegetated swales into the wetlands and stuff. You didn't have all the soil running down into the ponds and everything. Well, now 150 years later, we've completely disrupted that. But as of, say, about 1972, people said, well, wait a second, we completely altered this landscape. Let's try and correct what we can, understanding that, you know, this landscape is our economy. We rely on this landscape. We can't just say no more farming. We can't say no more asphalt. It's just not gonna work. But there is a lot of stuff we can do. So we all assume, for example, that the ponds that hold water here, or the sloughs, or the areas that are flooded right now are kind of what's always been. That's a wrong assumption. So, you know, our property is a good example where, if anybody knows where I live, I back up to Lake Medina, which is the big wetland. You guys know it's kind of identified as a natural resource area here, whatever. Right now, it's completely inundated with water. It's full. Well, it's also laced with ditches that were put there by the farming community back in the 20s and 30s. I mean, they ditched that pretty extensively. And for some period of time, it probably drained pretty well, but those ditches have all filled in pretty much, you know, over the years, because they're not maintained now. But all of that's been altered. And so when we see a lot of these wetlands or standing water, you can't know that that was the original condition. So long answer to your point, what is the original condition? We just don't know, but there are scientific standards, and we'll get into it a little bit later here. There are standards for what's acceptable in terms of the chemicals or the silt or whatever in the water. If this isn't the natural condition, what is the condition we try and achieve for say, phosphorus in the water or sediment in the water that's running off? What's acceptable and what's not? And we have come up with standards for that. So, you know, if you went back to 1850, I bet the water was pretty clean. I mean, you could probably stick your face in Lake Jubert and drink the water in 1850, sure, they did. I mean, or Elm Creek or Rush Creek, they just did. I wouldn't do it now, you know, it's not.
You can only do it once.
Right, yeah, you do it once. Anyway, we're getting, so the watershed performs the technical review. It's also one of the charges under the law is to conduct education. So in sort of a roundabout way, this is part of what the watershed is supposed to do, educate people. And then it also serves to provide financial and technical partnerships. So we provide funds, we serve as a conduit for money from other organizations for projects, And we also sort of collect technical partnerships to help people with, on that side of it. Next slide. Oh, this gets really dense, and I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly. So.
Hold your questions.
Yeah, so how do we know what the status of the water is out there? Well, Watershed conducted a big study several years ago called the Total Maximum Daily Load Study, TMDL study. And I'll just kind of gloss over this one, but the objective of the study was to determine what's the condition of the water. And the three primary pollutants addressed were phosphorus, E. coli bacteria, and suspended solids. And I can't tell you why, for example, nitrates isn't included in that study, or non-organic chemicals and stuff. You know, PFAS is a real hot topic now. Back when this was studied, there were only a handful of people who understood PFAS, and they all worked for 3M and DuPont. But so that's not included, but those are the three main areas of focus. And then, once the study was conducted, and we'll talk about it when we get to the next slide, how it was conducted. The study identifies mitigation strategies for protecting waterways, creating stormwater mitigation standards. So the stormwater mitigation standards are the standards that the developers have to comply with. So we say you can only create so much flow rate, or we have to assure that you don't put more phosphorus in the water, so you have to do this, that, and the other to prevent that from happening. Those are the mitigation standards. The TMDL actually also adopted standards for siting and management of non-production livestock. So in Corcoran, that's a fairly big deal, hobby farms. So what should our common standards be for where animals can be pastured, what you do with manure, how often you have to take care of your manure, that kind of stuff. And so in Elm Creek, obviously western Hennepin is still a place where hobby farms are popular, so that's a relevant issue for the Elm Creek watershed. The objective of the study is to create outreach strategies to the farmers, the farming community. So again, recognize that farming activity, agriculture is all governed by state law. Local units of government do not have jurisdiction over ag practices. So if the local unit of government, the city, for example, wants to be involved with promoting water management practices, it has to be on sort of a voluntary support, you know, the carrot, not the stick kind of basis. The city doesn't have the authority to say, you have to keep your dairy cows 250 feet from the nearest waterway.
But does the watershed? Your
No.
commission? No, okay.
So
The
nobody
state.
has, nobody can.
The state does.
The state does.
The state
okay.
does. And you've heard of this, of the ditch laws, that was adopted, what, about 10 years ago? When were the ditch laws adopted? They would, I think, when Dayton was governor, I think during his tenure.
The buffer laws you're talking about, the more recent buffer?
Buffer laws, yeah.
Probably in the last 8 to 10 years,
Yeah, yeah. The buffer laws were a state law, and that's where the state asserted authority over agricultural practices, saying that you have to have, depending on the type of waterway, you have to have a buffered zone. You can't plow right up.
Right up to it, you can
Yeah,
only some
and it's
natural.
the same with livestock, and I don't offhand, Kevin, if you know the standards, but it's, you have to have a vegetative buffer between your animals and the ditch.
I have a quick question.
Yep.
So we had a call one time, and it was a resident who had seen, like, someone that comes and does septic, pulls septic out of people's septic systems.
Yeah.
And saw them spraying it on a specific, like, parcel.
Area.
Yeah, in Corcoran. Is that because they have a license? I'm assuming they have to
I-
have a
I-
license
yeah,
from
I'm pretty
Minnesota
sure
to
they
do that?
do.
'Cause-
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah. So, I don't know a lot about that, but I know, for example, if you run a feedlot and you have like liquid manure, you can get licensed for spreading that.
Well, I asked the guy pumping mine one time, where do you get rid of this? And he said, we spread it on farm
Fields.
fields.
Yeah.
I think that, don't quote me, I believe the distinction is if it's on a field that's used for other animals, you can do it. If it's on a field that's going to be going directly to
Crops.
some sort of food production, you can't do it. So it depends, that's the regulatory distinction. So if it's,
I read
if it's applied and then fed to animals, that's allowed, is my understanding.
And we're actually gonna get to a slide here that kind of is interesting, and an interesting angle on that same issue or question. So the final part of what the study is designed to do is to create strategies for the urban part of the watershed to have impact on water quality. So, should we have strategies for limiting heavy phosphorus fertilizer, lawn fertilizer? I mean, now's the season when everybody's throwing phosphorus on their lawn. Well, no, actually, some of the cities have banned the sale of phosphorus, high phosphorus fertilizers. So those are all part of the strategies, you know. Pet waste disposal, as soon as you get curb and gutter and drain sewers, then all the pet waste starts concentrating because it goes down the drain when it rains. Okay, so what do you do about that? Cities adopt ordinances saying, no, you gotta collect your pet waste and dispose of it, not let it run down the storm sewer. Et cetera, et cetera. Let's go to the next slide. So the way that we did the study, I say we, they did it before I was on there, was take direct data from 7 different lakes in Rogers Lake and Maple Grove. We don't need to go back to the slide, but Weaver Lake, Rice Lake, Diamond Lake, you know, some of the larger lakes that are up there in the northeast part of the watershed. And data was taken from 15 creek monitoring stations. And there were 2 monitoring stations that are actually right on Corcoran's border, up on 117 and 101 over by the church, St. John's Church, where, you know, it goes, Rush Creek goes under 101. The study identifies substantial E. coli loads in North and South Rush Creek and on the Corcoran borders. So what the study found was that there's substantial manure, animal waste, making its way into Rush Creek. What the study didn't do was find out where it's making it in. It's just, because these were just at the border, they didn't take readings inside the city limits. So that's the next point. The study did not establish from any collected data E. coli, phosphorus, or total suspended solids, TSS, within Corcoran. And that was just the limit of the study. When they did the study, they had limited access to some of these areas that they could actually go and collect data, because most of the waterways are on private property, the wetlands, the creeks or whatever, and unless they literally went up to somebody's door, knocked on the door and said, can I go on your back 20 there and take water samples, they couldn't do it. So a lot of the sampling was done where waterways would go in culverts under the road, and they could go in the right of way and take water samples. So that's part of the reason. The sources and location of the pollution within Corcoran were estimates. So they model stream flow, the speed of water, the volume of water, and the concentration of the pollutant within the water to try and get a sense for how much of it is coming from a different area. So it's more mathematical than actual data. And the other thing that they did, which was interesting, is it's called aerial pictometry. Well, that's Google Earth. They just they looked at pictures of Corcoran and counted the animal barns and estimated for every horse barn, we estimate 3 horses. Okay.
Sure.
And for every dairy operation, we estimate, and this was done, like I said, in 2015, the data, I think, maybe, something like that. So they said, you know, we see 7 dairy operations, and we estimate each one has 200 cows, so there must be, you know, 1,400 cows in Corcoran. And I've seen the data, and sitting here in 2023, the numbers are way off, but that was the limitation of the study. So my last point was that the TMDL is a broad brush tool. The next study, if you go to the next slide, it's called a sub-watershed assessment. So within the broader watershed itself, there are sub-watersheds, and the sub-watersheds are defined by the little individual creeks. So depending on where that drop of rain falls, not only is it ultimately ending up in Elm Creek, but it's also ending up in the North Fork of Rush Creek, or the South Fork of Rush Creek, or Elm Creek down. So you divide the big block up into sub-blocks depending on the nearest point of collection of the water. Okay, so there are 5 of those in Corcoran, and actually I put C map, and then I forgot to put the map in. So, we don't have a watershed. But And actually, you know what, Jessica, fly way back to that slide that had, this one.
That one?
So I could show you, no, go to the next one. So there's actually 2 sub-watersheds in Corcoran, and it makes it useful. I could actually find it, yeah. One sub-watershed is the South Fork of Brush Creek. And that's basically, if you split Corcoran in half diagonally, from the northeast to the southwest corner, this half is the North Fork Brush Creek, and this half is the South Fork Brush Creek. And those are the 2 sub-watersheds in the city of Corcoran. So we've already done a sub-watershed assessment for the North Fork of the Rush Creek. So the northwest half of Corcoran has already had a more detailed study conducted, and that's where they'll go out and take actual water samples. They'll do better modeling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was conducted in 2028. And the sub-watershed, that sub-watershed assessment broke the sub-watershed down even further into 6 areas and said, for each one of these 6 areas, we're gonna identify the top 10 problem areas and the top 10 projects that we could do in this area based on cost effectiveness. You know, how much would it cost overall to fix this problem, and how much impact would it have? Do we get a lot of bang for our buck by doing something there? The sub-watershed assessment also sets out examples of, you know, the things that can be done, like restoring wetland, regrassing the swales that are on the edge of farm fields, elevating tile intakes in farm fields, which has become more common. And I won't get into that, I only know enough to be wrong about that. What's interesting is the sub-watershed assessment for the South Fork of Rush Creek is scheduled for this summer. So this summer we'll do that study on the southeastern half of Corcoran. And where that's important, we'll get into a little bit later on. We've got kind of a convergence of a lot of development activity in the southeastern half of Corcoran. At the same time, we're going to be studying specifically what's our water quality and where, or do we have areas that we have issues, and do we have areas that we could be working on. Okay.
So does development generally decrease the amount of contaminants that are in those watersheds? Okay.
And I remember it was kind of, there was, you know, we used to get kind of comments that, you know, we'll work on water problems here when everybody in Maple Grove starts picking up their dog poop. And, you know, there's sort of this notion that, well, we just have natural areas out here and we don't have problems with water quality, and everybody who's putting tons of fertilizer on their manicured lawn and when their dogs poop in the storm sewer and washing their car in the driveway and all that kind of stuff, they're the ones who are creating all the water pollution. Well, the irony is they have strategies in place to counteract that, and development actually generally tends to reduce levels of pollution in the water. Because there's an authority in place that can control it at that point. And what's absent in undeveloped areas is the authority to do anything about it or control it, generally.
Is septic an issue, or how is septic an issue?
Septic?
Yeah.
Yes, short answer is yes, and that's actually another workshop. Going back several years, the city of Corcoran had the legal authority over septic systems in the city of Corcoran. So whenever you built, you had to go before the city wastewater commission and get approval for your septic design. And then if there was a violation or a problem, the local commission, it's just like Parks and Trails. I mean, it was before there was a Parks and Trails, we had planning commission and wastewater commission. And was it called wastewater?
I don't know.
Something like that.
You're really old.
Yeah. Lauren Conan was on it, and I remember that, and a guy who was an engineer was on it, and it was people who had an interest in that type of thing. And then it became a political hot potato, and at the time people said, we don't need to deal with this because Hennepin County has bigger staff and they're better equipped to deal with it anyway, so we're gonna hand jurisdiction over septic systems back to Hennepin County. So now, it's not actually the department it's not actually part of the environment department, is part of Public Works, you know?
I don't know. If you made me guess, I thought it was.
Or like the health department, it's strange, it's not who you
They
think it would
changed that
be.
around, yeah.
But Hennepin County has authority over it. And it's not a big ticket item for the
They
county.
don't, because when it was the city had it, it was like, you had to have it pumped every
Every
3
3
years, and you
years.
had to have, put it,
Your certificate.
prove it to the city
Right.
and stuff, and that went to the county. Well, I still get my pump, but,
Yeah, yeah.
but no, there's no
So there's,
regulation.
it's
telling you
not
'cause
as, it's not as thorough, and
Mhm.
I can't remember, I don't know if you are on an individual, and they're called ISTS, Individual Sewage Treatment System, not septic system, ISTS. I believe if you have when you record a deed, you have to certify that either you are or are not on an ISTS, and if you're on an ISTS, I believe you might have to have it certified as compliant in order to record the deed.
That sounds about
Does
right.
that sound-
I think they had to do that when we bought our house, I'm
Right.
pretty sure, because they had to put a new
Right.
ITS.
And that's what,
Yeah.
and that's why it always happens, that's why it happens when people buy or sell a house,
Yeah.
because you have to prove to somebody that it's compliant. So one of the things that the sub-watershed assessment would try to do, but it can't really, because again, you're talking about people's backyards, is try and determine how much of the E. coli pollution is actually coming from failed septic systems, who are too close to waterways, or who get flooded when we have conditions like we do now. Because if you think about it, places that maybe are old enough that they still have drain fields, not mounds, if they get flooded and they're not high functioning drain fields, they're washing all of that right into, with all the flood water. So, let's go to the next slide. Well, I want to skip over some of this stuff because we won't get to anything very interesting. So the watershed created out of that TMDL study, then the watershed has to create a management plan. And what that does is say, okay, we got the general policy requirements from the legislation. Now we've collected data and information. Now we have to come up with a statement of what our actual policies and goals and numbers and standards are gonna be, and how we're gonna get there. So it's just sort of, how do we implement this stuff that we know about? And that's the water management plan. It's just like the city's comp plan. It inventories what you have in terms of resources, what are your goals, how are you gonna get there? Do you have a program for implementing those changes? By law, then also each city has to do the same thing, create a water management plan. And Kevin and I were talking about it. This is the Corcoran Water Management Plan. It's an appendix to the comprehensive plan, and it's huge.
Huh?
It's huge. And it's got all of the policies and all of the standards at the Corcoran level. And this is kind of interesting, and this is a moment of extreme confession. I've been on the watershed for 4.5 years. I didn't even know about this until a week ago when I was preparing these slides.
I think that's a failure of me to make sure you saw that ahead.
Go figure, go figure. So now that I have it, there's a lot of information here, and I flagged one page, and it's not 3,758 pages, but it actually goes to the level of detail of identifying within the city what are specific projects that could or should be undertaken to improve water quality in the city. What would it cost to do that? And where does it land on our list of priorities? So there's actually a plan that exists where people have studied and said, these are things we could do to improve water in the city of Corcoran. This is what it would cost us to do it. And
Who
this.
did this study?
Huh?
The city did this?
Yeah, we did that in conjunction
This
with the
is the
requirements, so
consulting
it would be,
engineers.
yeah.
Okay.
So like Diane
Spectre.
Spector.
And actually Susan Nelson did a lot of that.
Yeah, that's
For
right.
folks that know her, she's a Corcoran resident, she worked for Wink at the time, so she
Yeah.
actually had some extensive involvement in that.
So we're gonna circle back to this eventually, and this actually, I think, might not be a bad workshop in and of its own. Just this thing, just to talk about what's in here, what do we, what's in here, what can we learn from this? What can we, is this a tool that can be useful for what we do? So anyway, we have that plan as well. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk for a quick minute here. How are we doing on time?
We are at 6:15 on the dot.
6:15?
Halfway down, halfway home.
Oh, okay.
We go a little.
Project development review. So we talked about the watershed compiles information, it creates policies, it creates strategies for how to correct stuff. Well, like I said, how do you actually go in and correct stuff? Unless it's a completely voluntary basis, a landowner says, oh, I want to restore my own wetland, you don't really have an authority to go in and say you should restore that wetland. But we do when people want to develop their property. So we talked about that a little bit. A developer comes in, and let's use the bigger projects as an example. We know that it's going to affect runoff. We know that it's going to change the amount of water that comes off. We know that unless it's managed properly, we're going to be washing all sorts of stuff into the water. So let's review that and make sure that they engineer that properly. And the easiest example for people to understand when you talk about big projects is all of a sudden these nice discrete little ponds pop up in the middle of these residential projects. Well, those are there for the obvious reason that we want the water to wash in there first, and we want stuff to settle out into that pond because it's easier to deal with it if we collect it there. And we also want something that can moderate the water that's running off of all the new driveways and streets. And so we don't create this gusher of water just running off where this little swale used to be. So what you do, you create these holding ponds. And the holding ponds are engineered to collect runoff water and hold it for a certain period of time or let it flow out over a certain period of time. While it's sitting in that pond, all the bad stuff is settling down to the bottom, and then periodically, every so often, every number of years, you go in there and you scoop all the bad stuff out and do something with it. So we used to call them NERP ponds. I don't know if that's NERP.
It's a design, NERP is a design standard,
Yeah.
which is very common.
Yeah, NURP, NERP pond. Let's see, so project review, the city's all
This
get
one or
together.
next one?
Go back to that. So the cities all hire an engineering firm to review the project, Stantec. If the city actually uses Stantec, like Corcoran, the watershed has a backup engineer because it'd be a conflict of interest for the watershed Stantec engineer to review the city's Stantec engineer's design plan. So we have 2 or 3 engineers because all the cities are applicants as well when they come in. In 2022, the watershed reviewed 49 development proposals, so that's split among the various cities. I don't know how many in Corcoran, Kevin, maybe half a dozen.
Yeah, maybe pushing to 10. There was
Yeah,
a fair
yeah,
amount.
because of the activity here. So then what happens is the watershed does its review and then issues a report back to the city that says the watershed reviewed this, the commissioners approved it with the following requirements. Kevin will get that report, and then when he goes to the city, the planning commissioner, city council, he'll say, okay, as a part of our review process, we have to review all the development aspects, and one of those requirements is watershed review. The commissioners reviewed it, they've approved it, but they're requiring 3 things. So then the city says, okay, we'll approve your project, but you have to do the 3 things as required. You have to do it according to the plans you submitted, but you also have to satisfy these conditions that the watershed pointed out. But the city's the one that actually has the police power and the authority. So our recommendation to the city is just like, say, a planning commission recommendation to the city council. We do all the legwork, but it's the city that has the enforcement power. So if the city issues the permits, and if the developer violates the conditions, it's the city that comes back and says, okay, wait a second, we're gonna enforce this with the violation, we're gonna cite you or do whatever, stop your project. It's not the watershed that does that. Remember where it was a watershed district, the watershed district would have been the one to issue the permit or to enforce the violation. But here it's the city. So the technical review addresses 6 potential areas: stormwater management, erosion control, floodplain alteration, wetland alteration, bridge and culvert crossings, and buffer strips. And we don't really have time to look at it tonight, but I brought in 2 examples here. For example, the Napa. If you look at the Napa project, we're gonna flip through it fairly quickly, but it shows you the scope of the review and the amount of information that's required. So at the top, under project review, it tells us where's the project, what's happening there. Well, it's in Corcoran on 116. It was a proposal to build a new commercial building for Napa. And then down below that, it says Watershed Management Commission rules triggered. And it shows 6 different rules. And it was the determination of, say, either Kevin or the technical staff, that this project will affect 2 of the 6 areas that we're concerned about. Stormwater management and erosion control. So those were rules D and E, and that would be under the 3rd generation plan. What rules under our plan are affected by this development proposal? What we found was that there was no wetland alteration, rule G. And if you all think about that Napa site, it was high and dry. It already had ditches on the highway. There's no wetland there. That's easy. So the engineers collectively decided, well, we're not gonna, there's no impact on rule G, so we don't have to consider that. They don't have to do anything. So it goes through who the parties are. And then if you flip the page, the developer is required to submit their engineering design so that our engineers can evaluate when the water falls on the roof of the new building, where's it gonna go? How much water is gonna come running off of that site, and where's it gonna go when it runs off? And, the engineer who reviewed it, if you look down, stormwater management rule D, that's towards the bottom of that 2nd page. They talk about why does this impact our stormwater management issue. What I really want you to look at is when you turn to page 3, as they're talking about stormwater management, the bold heading at the top here says rate control. Well, they're talking about how fast is the water leaving the various surfaces, how fast is the water moving. Beneath the chart, it says abstraction controls. This is interesting. Abstraction is related to how much of the water that falls on the property soaks into the property. How good is the property itself capable of retaining the water that falls on it? And so in areas where there's a lot of sandy, porous soil, you have a lot of abstraction, which means all that rainwater wants to stay on that property, which means it's also getting filtered on that property. Okay, in Corcoran, where there's a lot of clay soils, you have low abstraction rates, which means a lot of the water that hits ground in Corcoran wants to run off. It doesn't soak in very fast. That also means that it's not leaving its pollutants behind, it's taking the pollutants with it as it runs off. Okay, so that's abstraction. What happens is the engineers then, they create the chart for the commissioners to look at, and if you look, say, at the top, at direction, condition, drainage areas, what they're doing is saying, as we evaluate the direction that the water runs, we evaluate it in terms of a 2-year event, a 10-year event, and a 100-year event. And that is the intensity of the rainfall. How often do we have a rainfall that has this intensity? And we might have a rainfall of this intensity every other summer, a 2-year event. We're gonna get a rainfall, and I'll pick numbers, they'll be wrong, Kevin can correct me, but let's say we get a rainfall where we have 1.5 inches of rain within 3 hours. Well, how often does that happen? Maybe every other summer, maybe every 3 years or whatever. That would be a 2-year event. If we got 1 inch of rain within a couple of hours, that would be a 2-year event. Okay, going all the way over, how often do we get a rain that only happens once every 10 years? How often do we get a rainfall where in the span of the afternoon we get 3 inches? Maybe every 10 years, 10-year event. And then a 100-year event. How often do we get a rainfall where we'll get 7 inches in 24 hours? Well, maybe once every 100 years. So anyway, the engineers evaluate how likely is it that we're going to get a rainfall that delivers this much water that fast, and if we get a rainfall that delivers this much water that fast, how are we going to manage that runoff? Okay, is it going to overwhelm this? Is it going to overwhelm the engineering, or is the engineering done in a way that it can accommodate that 7 inches in 24 hours? It's going to happen once every 100 years, that kind of thing.
It's
So
been happening more frequently, so
it's
that's
been
a,
happening a lot.
that's a percentage, so 1 divided by 100, so a 1% chance of that type of storm happening. It could happen 3 times in a summer. That's just what that definition means.
Right. So then, if that type of rainfall occurs, how will this engineering reduce the amount of water and how fast the water's flowing off? I guess it's not technically accurate to say the amount, but how fast that water will run off. And the charts, you need to spend time with the chart to understand it, but what it's saying here is we actually improve those rates by constructing on the site. We actually improve what would happen if we had a 100-year rainfall. The downhill property from Napa would actually be damaged less by building Napa. Does that make sense?
Does the slower rate then help the water stay in place
Stays.
so it builds better?
Correct.
I mean, it's not eroding.
And it doesn't erode. That's the other part of it. It's not eroding the ditches, because in Corcoran, again, we still have grassed ditches. Well, all the communities do, you know, conveying that water. And if you just, you know, fire hose that water into that grassy ditch, it's gonna erode that ditch. So that's part of what this is addressing and improving. This one doesn't talk about sediment, the other areas, but what I want you to see the chart, because that's the answer. How do you improve situation through development? Well, you require the engineers to come up with plans that actually leave it after development in a better shape than it was before development. And that also happens with phosphorus. So for example, the engineers have standards, and they can determine, and here are the residential households that are a better example, because they can say, we can calculate the amount of phosphorus that's leaving that farm field now, and we can calculate the amount of phosphorus that will leave that farm field after we put 40 houses on it. So we're gonna engineer this development so that even though we're gonna increase the total amount of phosphorus that's hitting the ground, we can actually keep more of it on site longer, so that the ultimate end of doing this development is less phosphorus is making its way into Rush Creek. Okay, more of it's staying on the parcel. And so less phosphorus in Rush Creek, less phosphorus in the Mississippi River. And this didn't trigger that rule, so.
It actually is,
Did it?
yeah, it's on the top of page 4.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you flip the page and that's where,
Good. Table 2,
yes.
page 4.
So you got your TP and TSS.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
So when you look at table 2 on the top of page 4, it has the condition 1.51 acre was the size of the site, and then TP load, total phosphorus load, pounds per year. TSS, total suspended solids, that's silt load, pounds per year. Then we talked about abstraction. We'll just kind of ignore that one for the time being. But you see, pre-development was 1.4 pounds of total phosphorus per year on that site or leaving that site. And the total amount of silt, pounds per year, 259 pounds per year. And then the development, it says post-development without best management practices. If we allow the development and did nothing, the total phosphorus from that site a year would actually go up by ½ pound. The total silt would go up by about 100 pounds. But because we're imposing requirements on them to improve the situation, the post-development with the best management actually goes down 0.4 pound for phosphorus, and it goes down 86 pounds of silt per year, because, and if you drive by, the next time you drive by there, you'll notice now between the building and Heidi's, there's a new pond. There's a collection basin there. And that collection basin is capturing the phosphorus in the silt. And actually, the amount of phosphorus and silt leaving that parcel of land is less than when it was the liquor store.
So it's very purposeful when they're doing the development where they're placing those ponds to try to capture. that.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yep.
Just a heads up, we're at 6:30. If you want to
Okay.
take a little bit longer, you certainly can.
Yeah, what do you,
As
well,
allowed by Chair Anderson.
we're sort of,
Just sort of, I mean, this provides something of an answer as why does new housing cost so much money?
Yeah,
It's because this is expensive stuff to do.
This is all part of
This
the
is-
cost structure of doing
It's
it.
not like, well, you take your materials and you go out and build a house, there's not $300,000 worth of materials, like, no, there isn't, but
Right, right.
if we don't do this, then we'll hate that development forever.
even in designing mini park over there, we're gonna need
Yes.
this stuff. Him shaking his head.
And I brought another example, which was the Stott Farms project, and I'm gonna talk right over that one, I'll take just a couple minutes and finish up here. Stott Farms was an example where a family bought some of the farmland on the west side of Lake Hubert, and they decided to improve some of the swales that had been plowed, so they actually grassed those swales over. And because it was a project that affected runoff, it had to get reviewed, and so the commission did a review on that. That's an example, this is a prime example where the project got support from public money to help regrass those swales. Hennepin County provided the technical expertise. The Watershed Commission reviewed it to make sure it complied with standards. And it's reducing the amount of phosphorus and sediment that goes into Lake Hubert, and I've got the information somewhere, and I can't tell you, but it's significant. It's a classic example where all of these factors came together to do something to improve the water quality in Lake Hubert. Okay.
But it doesn't have these same,
No, it's,
Charts in
it talks about the drainage area and the amount of
Because-
water flowing down the waterways.
because it's a different type of situation.
Right, it's a different type of
Okay.
project, and that's why I brought it in.
Yeah,
This was not a development-driven one, this was an outreach between Hennepin County staff and other funding agencies. The city of Corcoran, when Ken referenced, public money, it was not the city of Corcoran.
right.
Just to be clear.
How the review fees established? I just was curious, because one's really, really high and one's much smaller.
Yeah, so the Watershed Commission creates a fee schedule based on the type of review that takes place, because some of it's more involved than others. And there's kind of a checklist to determine what that fee is, and it's an escrow type of fee. So the developer is required to deposit that, and the Watershed applies that to its consultants, and if there's anything left over, the developer gets it back. If it's not enough, they have to replenish it. And that's actually newer for the Watershed. I want to talk a little bit about the educational opportunities. Let's, like 5 or 10?
Yeah.
Okay.
Our meeting is until
The
7.
meeting's not till 7.
So,
Okay.
yeah, fine.
Yeah, Jessica, if you could go to, that's enough about development. Educational activities is part of the legal requirement. So there's we the Watershed, joined with Bassett, and Shingle Creek in West Mississippi to create, it's called West Metro Water Alliance. And they actually created a grade school curriculum on water quality issues. Why do we like clean water? And it's like for fourth grade, I think. And as you can see, in 2019, back before classroom sort of disruption, within the watershed, we're not talking about just within the cities, but within the watershed, there were 161 classroom visits. 4,100 students received this program. That WMWA, as it's called, the West Metro Water Alliance, is now also collaborating with another water management organization to hire a full-time coordinator to be an education and outreach coordinator. So we're sort of recombining now, and I'm hoping that coordinator will actually do stuff like this, or help do stuff like this, go out to city groups or whatever organizations and say, look, here's why water matters, here's what you can do to be involved in this, and here's how we can support you with education or resources. Here's an example where there's much more activity recently on chloride education, so Elm Creek is participating financially in funding chloride education, primarily for people who are involved in maintenance and service, like lawn companies, or the people, I shouldn't say guys, the people who do commercial plowing, educating on proper chloride application to try and get some of the chloride out of the water. And the last two are actually endeavors that a group like this could be involved in or follow up with, and one is called the Lawns to Legumes program. And there's an organization called Blue Thumb that I think was actually in Shingle Creek maybe, created this organization to promote approaches to lawn growth and management that are pollinator friendly. So I know at the U of M, the people in the ag department were researching, you know, what kind of lawn mixes that can we create that have legumes in them so they're pollinator friendly. You know, can we create lawn mixes that have things like clovers in them that are acceptable to people within a lawn type of aesthetic, but also are pollinator friendly. So that's that program. They have, I was gonna go down and get some brochures and I didn't get down there.
We had something, is there a website?
Yeah, they are, and I was gonna bring the brochures out and show them to you, but let's follow up on that. The other one I wanted to talk about was the Resilient Yard Workshop, and it's the same thing. It supports people who want to create water gardens as a part of their water runoff control.
Rain.
Rain gardens, yeah. So, for example, an easy example is in your own yard, you know, if you have concentrated water runoff in a place, can I put in some sort of garden that actually can capture that runoff? And can I do it in an aesthetically pleasing way, you know, that helps manage my runoff situation? And the answer to that is yes, you can. But these are examples of the programs, and we can get follow-up information on those. Go to the next slide, Jessica, I'm going through here. I'm gonna skip over these pretty much. Three Rivers, we do a lot of work with Three Rivers because they have a huge technical staff and they have the ability to monitor water. So we fund them for some of the work that they do. Hennepin County Department of Energy and Environment, they actually have outreach people now who are active in Corcoran working with landowners on projects. So I don't know if you've heard, for example, about the Bottom project, the acreage that Bottom owns. He's restoring a bunch of that acreage. And so he's getting technical assistance from HCEE, and his project will also qualify for potential support, grant money support. A lot of restrictions, but, you know.
What is it now, what's he restoring it to?
I think it was cropland, wasn't it?
I
Most
think
of
it
it?
was,
Like
he's trying
several
to Oak
acres.
Savannah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Like
was
several acres?
tilled land, and it's like 30 acres or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But I wanted to also mention, so ACEE, this is interesting, we received a card in the mail. They sent out a card to everybody in Hennepin County over 5 acres, I think, or in the waters in northwest Hennepin. And there was an open house at the Medina Community Center up by the Hamel Bank there last week on the 13th, and it was on horse pasture management. They had a woman from the U of M and in equine management at the U come and give a lecture on good stewardship horse pasture management. So not only how do you have healthier pasture and healthier horses, but how do you do that in a way that's environmentally friendly. So there's an example, and then Hennepin helps fund that, and Elm Creek funds that kind of stuff too. And then the last one I wanted to mention, because there's a program where citizen volunteers receive training and funding to go out and actually do the lake water monitoring, collect the water samples to help us compile the data. And Lake Jubert qualifies for that. We could study, and Sharon did that.
Okay.
And it's a commitment. You have to go out once a week and do scientifically valid water sample collection. The issue with Jubert was we didn't really have access because you have to get one of the property owners say, yeah, it's fine if you leave your canoe on my lawn and whatever. Well, Stott Farms now, we actually have a naturalized area on the west side of Lake Jubert with direct access to the lake, and they're willing to let the volunteer do that, which would mean keeping a rowboat or a canoe on the property, and then somebody going out once a week and taking the water samples during spring, summer, fall months needs a volunteer. So if you have any ideas at all, any ideas on someone that might be interested in that, I always thought perfect independent study project for a high school biology student who has a teacher who's willing to mentor them a little bit. you know, that kind of thing. It has to be somebody who has the ability and responsibility to manage watercraft. So either you do it with somebody who can do that, or.
How complicated is it? I mean, I'm not thinking myself, but I'm thinking for
Yeah.
maybe someone else, that's all.
I don't
I think
think.
once you get on the lake, I don't think it's.
You're
that
just
big.
kind of dipping tubes in
Yeah, dipping
and
tubes
parking
and-
them and
right, right,
whatever
right.
depth they're at or where
Right.
they're at or
Right.
whatever it is.
Right.
Do you have to provide your own boat?
If we had a volunteer, we would find a boat PDQ.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't think that's an issue.
It doesn't have to be the same day every week.
I don't know the amount, I don't know exactly how, you know, if it has to be within certain hours, within certain days. I don't know enough about it, to be honest with you. but-
I just know an RN that lives in Corcoran that has a kayak and she's all
We're gonna,
that type of.
we're gonna follow up, because at the last watershed meeting, when we talked everybody into authorizing Jubert to be the lake to get the funding, I said, I'll help find a volunteer. So this was my first outreach.
Yeah, if you
try
want
and
to
find a
email me some more
volunteer.
details and if
okay.
it falls into,
All right.
but like I said,
I
with
may
those,
have some
with
ideas.
those mixed.
Ken, if you just wanna send it to me, I can send it out to the.
There you go.
And you know, what, and we'll definitely, I know there is there is a website, and it talks about the activities, and it gives all the background, so we'll make sure that gets distributed. Let's jump over so we can get finished here. Let's go to the next slide. So, there's a lot of money that flows through the watershed, and without getting into too much
Not getting the
detail,
water.
I'm gonna tell you, there's a lot of money available for doing water projects. The challenge is that it requires someone else, the partner in all of this, to put up either time and energy or money themselves. It's like grants. I mean, there's a lot of money to support stuff, but you have to step forward and say, and we're willing to do this. Can you help us out with a grant? Or we got the people, we got the energy, we want to do this. Okay, fine, we can find you the money. The people aren't just going to hand you money without the commitment. So every year, the watershed itself will levy up to $500,000, and that levy goes against the tax base within the watershed, and it's tacked on to the county taxes. So the watershed can approve projects within the watershed that it will assist to fund. And an example of one of the projects, a recent one, was the city of Plymouth restored Elm Creek as it flows past Wayzata High School. That's within our watershed. So Elm Creek funded that. Individual projects can receive up to $250,000. So the Elm Creek watershed gave the city of Plymouth $250,000. You say, well, wait a second, they're a big, rich city. Why did we give them $250,000? Well, for two reasons. One, it's all our water. That water started in Medina, it passes through Plymouth, and it ends up someplace else. It's all of our water, but also the city of Plymouth itself put up something like $5 million to do that project. So the point there is that there was a commitment by the city itself to clean up that Elm Creek, and then they went around and said, where else can we get funding to support this project? And they probably got money directly from the DNR, but they got an allotment from the watershed. So the watershed does this every year, and the cities will submit their proposals. It's usually the city. It doesn't have to be a city, but it's usually the city that will say, we want to do this, that, or the other, and here's our funding model, and we'd like the watershed to contribute some amount of money.
Okay, and here's my I kind of don't get it question. And you can make the answer brief. How do you restore a creek? I don't know what they're doing
Oh,
to it
sure,
to
okay.
restore it. I don't.
So you try and replicate the original banks of the
Okay.
creek as much as possible. And so if we get back to what did farming do, it created all of these washouts and eroded areas, and it changed the dynamics of how the water made it to the creek, and then once it got into the creek, how it flowed down the creek. And that's not only farming, but other impacts. So they'll create they'll create stone piles at the elbows to keep the elbows from washing out, or the inside of the elbow, they'll put like rip-rappy type of things, or
Like those gating areas.
lumber stuff. But they also do replant a lot of vegetation. Or they'll do actually stuff in the bed of the creek, won't they, to moderate the flow?
Well, and actually some of that's even for they'll create basically bubbles, oxygen, for like fish habitats.
Right.
Depending on how the stream operates and where fish might live or it's a habitat restoration, so in some cases they want more oxygen, but some cases it's all very unique and specialized, but it's a slope stabilization, a lot of times they'll open it up more, because to get to prevent the erosion, which is the TSS, you'll have to kind of cut some trees back, and then you get more of the grasses and long grasses.
So,
You'll change the speed of it, you'll change it'll wind more versus being linear ditches oftentimes. And then it could be, at the bends, it could be reinforcements. A lot of times the trees they cut down, they shove in as a reinforcement, so it's a natural reinforcement, and then like you could do stuff depending on the type of species in the stream, you could add ripples or other things that would.
so one thing we just approved for a smaller sum of money is, do folks generally know where Denny Steig Farm, Northeast Corcoran, okay? Bounded on the north and west by a sod farm off of 116, and then on the north and east by a lot of development. And you know that the tree stand on the north side of the Steig Farm, there's about 30 acres of, I don't know, we reviewed it, it's outside of Corcoran for the most part, but he's got about a 30-acre original maple basswood plot, unaffected, which qualified for legacy grant funding for the city of Rogers to buy from the Steig family to turn into a city park. So it'll be preserved, okay, and that's the whole point. And it's a really nice sort of project.
His property's in two cities.
Right, he's
isn't it?
he's right on the border, and
Yeah.
that's across the border.
Mhm.
But one of the things that the watershed just approved for the city of Rogers is to restore the original meander of the wetland that was the eastern part of this, where the sod farm lets off. Then east of that, the sod farm is all ditched, obviously, and drained, but the water flows eastward, and there was a straight line ditch there that conveyed the water into wherever, it must be Rush Creek at that point. They're gonna restore the meander. Basically, they're gonna restore that to the prior condition of a meandering waterway.
Is that the same place that, butts 116, the sod
Yeah.
farm?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
so that's on that side.
Right, where the power lines are on that side, the north side.
How can you get away with having a tractor there? That big tractor that's in the ditch? It's just as curious to me because he's trying to flow the water away. So he's
Right,
got like
yeah.
a pump going, I'm just curious. 'cause it's
Oh,
like-
you
Like
mean
at the
the
sod
sod
farm?
farm?
Yeah.
Oh, they're probably an agricultural operation, it's not a local.
Yeah.
We don't have authority over that, and they probably are grandfathered in on whatever.
Is that
Yeah,
what you
it's
said?
City of Rogers, so I don't have.
Yeah, that's
but-
a newer sod, and that hasn't been there that long.
We're really running over here, but,
Right.
I don't know.
so anyway, there's a lot of money available. We kind of leave it at that. But here's one thing I wanted to mention. You see down here, WPIF, watershed-based implementation funding. It's money that comes from the legacy amendment. We're all generally familiar with that. This funding is gonna fund that South Rush Creek sub-watershed assessment. So we're gonna get that detail about southeastern Corcoran. The total budget for that project, Kevin, I want to offhand, is $90,000 to conduct that study.
Mhm.
City of Corcoran's portion of that is gonna be something like $1,200, I want to say.
Sweet.
So the city of Corcoran had sort of stepped forward and said, we want to learn this about our city, our natural resources, and we're gonna put some money up, $1,200. And lo and behold, $92,000 study is gonna result. And that's basically the city of Corcoran's study. The South Fork sub-watershed is us. So this might be a good place to stop, because what's relevant here is that the city is thinking about things like, should we have a water area charge? And I don't know how much you folks are aware of that, but should we have a more focused effort of studying, funding, and promoting water-related projects in southeastern Corcoran? And where I kind of want to leave it here is, to what extent are these water projects an inherent part of natural resource management in Corcoran? And I think if there's a group of people, that might be a good group of people to think in terms of, do we do natural resource management as a city? Why not have Parks and Trails be the people who think about that? You know, because it's public, it's open, it's recreational space, and recreational space is generally open space, and open space is primarily natural resource space in this community until we do something else with it. So I just want to plant that seed a little bit, that maybe at some point in time we reach the level where we're also, might be parks and trails and natural resources. Just a thought. And the last thing I will say, is go to the last slide, because this is the best part of all. So, in order to do our business, we charge the member city dues, and that kind of covers the administrative portion of it. The developers pay their own fees to get their projects reviewed, so that's kind of a wash. A lot of grant money going on, but our member dues for all of the cities was $250,000. So Corcoran is 28% of the land area, and we pay 7.5% of the dues. Maple Grove is 20% of the land area, and they pay 46% of the dues. Because it's based on tax capacity within the watershed. So Corcoran, farmland, low tax capacity, Maple Grove, Arbor Lakes, big tax capacity, small land area. So it's a good, it helps people in Corcoran to understand that if we manage this effectively, we get a lot of leverage out of what we put into it and what we can get out of it. And I think, to me, that means opportunity, but it also means, you know, are we aware of where the opportunities lie? So, you know, I think we probably can do more in terms of our community outreach on some of the programs. You know, how can we promote stewardship within the community? Across the spectrum of our experiences, we've got everything from people living on residential, you know, 5 to the acre suburban lots, to people on hundreds of acres. We're all part of this community. There are opportunities that apply to each one of us individually. And can we sort of get our arms around that collectively as a community? So maybe as somebody on lawns to legumes, you know, maybe I should put some of this new mix in if I control that. Or wait a second, you know, maybe I get a couple of my horses out of the floodplain if I can figure out how to do that. You know, that's the range of what we need to be thinking about.
Just to piggyback off that, I think the watershed as a whole, or the other member cities, would be very happy to invest in Corcoran. So it's not, I mean, Ken's
Absolutely.
point's well taken, but they're thirsting to invest in Corcoran, and they look at, this is the water coming at me. So if I can make investments up there, I don't have to worry about it down here.
Right.
So we're kind of at the top, we're at the roof, they're in the gutter. So they're basically paying for it, and they just need projects that we can step in and kind of lead or advocate for or champion. And I think you would see, you know, from a resource allocation, if we had it, we would tip, I think, you know, if we had projects and we were toe-to-toe at the ceiling, I think a lot of the member communities would want to invest in Corcoran. So it's
think,
that
yeah.
opportunity that Ken's talking about. It's not like we're wasting our time. It's like we gotta educate, we gotta build, we gotta do it right. We don't wanna, you know, we wanna do it step by step, but there is a huge opportunity there, and it's the watershed as a collective would love to step in and carry a lot of the wherewithal and the financial aspect.
And I think the bigger, Maple Grove, the bigger cities, understand that we're at a point in our development as a city, we're not like them. We're not gonna pick a half-mile stretch of a creek and put $5 million into restoring it. That's just not realistic in our community. We just don't have that. What we do have is a lot of opportunity where we can get more bang for our buck. So in Plymouth and Maple Grove, they're actually going back and retrofitting stuff that's already taken place and trying to fix the damage that's already been done. In this community, we've got more of a blank slate, and I think, you know, so it's a question of, are we aware of things that we can really have a big impact, even at our level of investment or our level of commitment? And I think there are. It's just, are we aware of them? Well, that gets back to this. We are aware of it, actually. So we go back and look at that then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for
It was very
listening.
educational.
You know, I know now you can put like motion in these things and.
And you know, Ken, I express a nice word about Ken is that Ken has done a lot for the watershed districts. He's raised Corcoran is also incredible for the city. But he's really up the game for Corcoran. He's been really careful about how the commission spends his money and how the policies are impacted. So he's really helped make that a more streamlined, more effective organization for us.
Thank you.
No small accomplishment.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm the treasurer of the Watershed Commission, so
Oh, yeah?
actually, that's an example where it was an organization where you could ask the commissioners, how much do we spend on this and why? And they were kind of like, and I said, you need to come to Corcoran circa 1995 and have people question you about your budget in a room like this where they're standing that far away from you. And if a council member said, well, I don't know where this money went, people were in your face.
Yeah.
And it's not, this is probably all being recorded.
That's okay.
Well, it's
Doing
different.
nothing wrong.
In the big cities, they're insulated from a lot of that direct encounter, so they don't quite think about it the same way we do. But, and I don't know I can't speak for what the meetings are like anymore, but you guys know, 20 years ago, there was a lot of.
Yep.
All
Thank
right.
you, Ken. We appreciate it.
I do need a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Just roll.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
Tom made the motion?
All in favor? Yeah.
Yes.
So I'll get information on those programs or whatever, and,
Yeah, if you got anything on that,